Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining. My name is Stacey Sinclair, and we are delighted to be back with you again this week. So today we are, of course, speaking about inflation and materials shortages in the construction industry, an issue that no doubt is affecting everyone on this call today in some way or another. So it's timely that we have Fenwick Elliott partners David Bebb and Claire King here with us today to take us through the situation and what you can do to protect yourself. Both Dave and Claire are specialists and experts in construction engineering and energy law, advising employers, contractors, consultants, and supply chain. And I'm delighted to say that both are regular speakers on this webinar series. Dave heads our non-contentious group, and Claire's expertise is in dispute resolution of all methods, including TCC litigation, arbitration, and adjudication. So before I hand you over to our speakers, a few admin points. Everyone is on mute. And can I encourage you to please ask questions as we go? And I will put those questions, as many as I can, to Claire and Dave at the end. And do rest assured that the slides of today's session and a copy of the on-demand recording will be available in due course on our website. And if you can locate the chat box on the toolbar on the right, I think you can see I've popped the link to where you'll find those slides and recording in due course. So with that, Claire, I think, can I hand over to you?
You can indeed. Thank you, Stacey. So what are we going to cover today? Well, first of all, I'm going to have a very brief look at the issues that are being faced by the industry at the moment, because that obviously sets the backdrop of the webinar and what we're going to be looking at, how you can approach those issues to minimise your risks. We're going to be looking at how the standard forms can assist you in facing those issues, or not assist you, depending on the case, as the case may be. Dave's going to be doing an in-depth dive into the JCT standard form. And then I'm going to look at the NECA and FIDIC forms and what they provide in relation to inflationary protection or not. Then last of all, we're going to give you some ideas, things to think about, including changes you may want to make to those standard forms to minimise your risks in the current climate. So what are the issues being faced by the industry? Well, as everybody will have seen the news this week, inflation is going through the roof. It's been compared to the 1970s. This is a snapshot from the ONS website taken this week. You can see material price index, the all work categories increased by 20.1% since this time last year, so that's enormous. Construction News today was saying that Mace is forecasting that tender prices will be 3% higher this year than last year. We've obviously got shortages in key materials, and that's just a quote from Dewson from The Guardian earlier this month. Basic things you need for building sites, cement, plasterboard, insulation, are being rationed by some manufacturers. And other things have much longer lead times, which feeds into delays to the site. For example, the Construction Leadership Council's September update said the lead times for concrete roof tiles is now approaching 24 to 30 weeks. That may obviously have an impact on your programme. We've got increased global demand following COVID-19 and economies waking up again. Transportation issues, particularly here in the UK, but also things like the Suez Canal clearly not helping. Brexit in the UK, shortage of hauliers, shortage of petrol, as we're all probably experiencing at the moment, and then other issues such as a lack of gas across Europe, particularly acute in the UK. So that's obviously feeding into the risks that construction projects are facing at the moment. Increased insolvency risk at all levels of the supply chain is a reality at the moment. There are obviously choices to face. Do you price or try and price to the extent you can predict the material increases into your tenders, or try and pass the risk down to subcontractors, suppliers? To what extent can they actually take that risk? We've also got the delay costs and the risk of liquidated damages if projects get delayed because of the shortages. All of that is being seen already in increased cost claims, either going on the basis of express contractual contractual provisions if you have those, luckily in your contract, but also either expressly or impliedly sort of hiding in claims for variations or delay. So with that very cheerful backdrop in mind, I'm going to hand over to Dave to look at the JCT standard form.
Thank you, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me get the slides working. Right. So what am I going to look at? I've got to split my talk into two parts. I'm going to talk, first of all, about where we have an existing contract. So we've already signed up to some terms. What can we do given the current problems? And then the next part of my talk, slightly later on, we'll deal with what we do for new contracts looking forward. Now, it's slightly ironic, isn't it? I was probably sat here 12, 14 months ago, along with everyone else in the industry, dusting off contracts, dealing with how we sort out the COVID issue. It's slightly ironic that we're back here now, what, 12, 15 months on, and everyone is dusting off contracts to deal with another issue, whether directly as a result of COVID, we can come to discuss, but again, contracts are being dusted off again to deal with this. I'm going to focus on JCT, mainly because that is still got the bulk of the market in terms of building work in the UK. I'm going to focus on the D&B form and the standard form. There'll obviously be slight nuances and differences between different forms of JCT and obviously different forms of procurement. Obviously, DB and standard are both priced contracts. Okay, they are a fixed price and a fixed date to finish, subject to some certain extensions. Always bear that in mind. That's the starting position, unlike obviously other forms of procurement. My little second bullet point now, anyone who's been unfortunate to listen to previous webinars that I and other colleagues have done, or indeed any construction lawyer, is going to hear the same old mantra. It's all about the contract, and that is true. English law, again, says to the parties, you're big enough, old enough to divvy up the risks yourself. Don't come running off to us at a later date if you've signed a dud bargain. There is very limited legal magical dust we can sprinkle to improve a poor bargain. The provisions that are there are high hurdles. Force majeure and frustration of contracts are difficult things to overcome, and therefore you are stuck with looking at what you've got in a building contract. Obviously, this talk is split between two things: inflation and supply. The inflation element of in terms of the cost of materials. JCT has always had in there fluctuations provisions. I've been doing this 20 years, and if I'm honest, I can't remember the last time I saw a provision in JCT where it says, yep, fluctuations applies. If there are some fortunate people on the webinar at the moment that can look at their contract and got a box ticked against fluctuations, then bully for you, that's absolutely brilliant. But I'd imagine very few of you will have that. Fluctuations B and C, which deal with the materials, etc. of inflation, not even in the printed form. You need to bury around the JCT website to find where those provisions are. So I'm not going to focus huge amounts on those provisions in existing contracts, because I suspect very few people on the webinar today have got those provisions in contracts. What I would say is my little fourth bullet point there about every bit of the contract is relevant. As construction lawyers, I can only look at this bit. Of course, I'm looking at this contract in isolation of all the documents that are in the back. Okay, and I'm looking at this in its unamended form. So what the advice I'm giving today is very sort of, it's in a bit of a vacuum because it's not relevant to your particular project and the documents in your contract. All I would say, though, is it's surprising from all the jobs that we get involved in, and Claire as well, how much random documents get thrown in and called contract documents. It's always worth reading back through those contract documents to see what is in there dealing with this issue. You might see quotes from subcontractors provided in there that talk about lead times or accepting the quote within a certain time. That emails will find their way in there. Bits of meeting notes will find their way in there. It's always worth having a careful read through the rest of the contract documents. You can only read this when you also read all the other provisions in that contract. It's not read in a vacuum. A court will look at the entire contract and work out what the deal is. Okay, so that set the scene about the importance of the contract and every bit of the contract. Okay, let's go straight into then what provisions are in there in terms of dealing with materials shortages. Okay, early on in the contract, I'm talking around about clause 2.2 of the D&B version. There is a provision in there that deals with the availability of materials. Now, as a basic starting position, contractor must build exactly what is specified. Okay, it says ironmongery by X. That's exactly what has to be done. Okay, Likewise, if it's in the ERs or if it's in the spec, the principle is the same. The contractor builds and uses what has been specified for use. The caveat around that is the clause I quote here in the 4th bullet point. Materials and goods for the works shall, so far as procurable, bear that first point in mind, so far as procurable, okay? And then the second bit, if the contractor wants to change that, consent mustn't be unreasonably withheld or delayed. So there's 2 potential things to look at in that clause, okay? Now the practicality and reality of this is that it's only got limited application, hasn't it? Because there are certain elements of materials that you simply cannot do without. Concrete, steel are very difficult to substitute. It requires a fundamental change in the design very, very early on. I have had provisions, I've had certain projects now where certain profiles of rolled steel was not available, so we could change the design to get certain types of profile, but it's going to have limited application, I think, for core materials. It's much more relevant as you get towards the finishes of projects. So you're getting down to ironmongery, door sets, glazing sets. There's a bit more flexibility around those in terms of substituting materials on different lead times so as not to impact the program. But let's just look a little bit more about what that clause allows us to do. The first bit, so far as procurable. The way I read that is that it's either procurable or not. It's black and white, isn't it? It doesn't say so far as procurable, taking into account difficulties in getting it. I think it is procurable as in, can I buy it or not? Think about my ironmongery example. If the specification says ironmongery by manufacturer Y, model number Y, colour satin, as a contractor, if I go to the supplier and say, I want this, and they say it's no longer in production by the manufacturer, I think it's fair to say it's not procurable. If they say it is in manufacture, but I can't get the next batch for 10 weeks, it is procurable, but it's going to take longer to get. Okay, I think there's a subtlety in how that wording is written. Second bullet, the obvious sweetener, of course, is a cost saving. In 95% of the cases, this is rarely an issue because an employer will consent subject to the cost saving that may well be offered. Okay, that brings into play whether consent is being unreasonably withheld or not. I have come across provisions where, as a condition of giving consent, employers have requested a cost saving, even though there may not be a cost saving. There's an awful lot of law around whether you are unreasonably withholding consent or not. Unexpectedly, unsurprisingly rather, the courts will say it rather depends on the circumstances. But I think as a contractor, if there was an employer suggesting that they would give consent subject to requesting a significant cost saving where there actually isn't one, consider whether that consent is being unreasonably withheld or not. Okay. Next one. Just bear in mind for the CAs, contract administrators, employers, agents out there, consent under this clause is just that. It's a concession to a contractor to allow the contractor to do something different than was bargained for. Be careful how any provision under this is written. As a CA, I would be saying very carefully, if I'm consenting to a substitution, I'm making it very clear that it is a consent under this clause and there is nil cost and nil time impact. Because it could be written very differently as an instruction to omit, and in the usual way that may well be something treated as a change in the usual way. Law on being something unreasonably withheld. I've talked about the withholding of the consent unreasonably. What about the delay element of it? If an employer takes a significant amount of time to agree the change, okay, consider whether that triggers another provision in the contract which effectively says, well, if the employer is taking a long time to decide the change, or the CA is, does that trigger time and money in the usual way? It may well do. Okay, and I'll touch on later about how you should deal with that as a contractor. Obviously, bear in mind it is limited just to materials. The issues we have at the moment, of course, are not just materials, but our labour, our transport. So it is available. It is limited only to goods and materials. Now, as Claire's mentioned, that's not quite wide enough to capture the things that we are seeing in the industry at the moment. Right, so having looked at that basic bit about material substitution, I then looked at the list of time events in the contract. And obviously, time is a creature of the contract. If that event is not listed in your contract, it's not a provision that allows time. So you've got to try and squeeze it into one of the 14 or so relevant events that JCT deals with. Okay, This time last year, we were looking about whether it amounted to whether COVID amounted to a force majeure, which is item 14. I've looked at the other relevant events to think, right, how could we possibly squeeze some of the current problems into these relevant events? Claire mentioned touching on the sort of winter of discontent in the 70s. I don't think we're quite yet there in terms of slotting it into the strikes event. We're not quite in that position. It's just almost a perfect storm of global demand, etc., etc. So we're not quite in the provisions yet in terms of industrial action and strikes in the supply chain. Is there any government intervention, something the government has done, an exercise of its statutory power? This time last year, in terms of COVID, yes, there probably was. Yeah. Query whether there is at the moment. I don't think so. There is nothing in here that, in terms of government statutory power, I don't think that has caused or brought about the issues we're facing. I touched earlier on the employer playing ball and the employer doing what the contract requires them to do. Any impediment, prevention or default by the employer. So just think about, is the employer being unreasonable in holding that consent? Is it taking a long time to get that consent to do something? Does that trigger time? That's also a money event as well, remember, not just a relevant event, it's a relevant matter as well for money. Check on your JCT contract. Collaborative working is an optional provision in JCT. As a contractor, always query whether that has not been checked as an optional bit. So just query the obligation on the parties to act collaboratively in finding a solution to it, and whether that gives you something to hang your hat on. I mentioned named subcontractors just because JCT allows for them, but again, they are not widely used. But again, check the contract particulars at the beginning. If they are ticked and they apply, there are circumstances where that can give both time and money for named subcontractors. Otherwise, bearing in mind that the general rule of thumb, subcontractors are domestic unless it clearly says otherwise. So the problems down the supply chain are the contractor's problem. Finally, force majeure. I said this time last year, we were all debating whether COVID amounts to a force majeure. We're still waiting on a definite decision to say yay or nay either way. I know plenty of projects where time has been given on the basis of COVID, but we've yet to find anything sort of definitive on it. Again, query whether it is still a force majeure event. As I said, Claire mentioned, it's almost a perfect storm of all sorts of things, isn't it? Is it COVID related? Well, it's sort of indirectly related to COVID because it's a series of sort of pent up demand and now it's coming back online, but we've got the sewage issues, the transport issues, the HGV drivers. There's always going to be a grey area around whether something is a force majeure. There's a reason it is item 14 in JCT, because that is your last chance saloon generally as a contractor to claim the time. Okay. Can I claim any money as a result of it? Well, it rather depends, doesn't it, on what my relevant matters say in my contracts, the relevant events that give time and the relevant matters that give the money associated with the delay. For that, again, a contractor is going to need to show that that's either a change or some form of prevention or default by the employer. Again, that's the only head you can squeeze it in, I think. There's very limited provision otherwise to claim it as a relevant matter. Just a reminder of the basics, again, which anyone's listened to webinars before, you'd have heard the same thing. It's about following the contract to the letter. If you are being delayed by these issues, you need to be notifying forthwith. You need to be explaining to the client what you are doing to overcome the problem. You need to be setting out what the effect of a decision not being made promptly is. So I'd be saying to the client, right, there is an alternative solution to this, which is this. I will need an answer by X date, otherwise the impact is this. Okay. I mentioned again, unreasonable delay triggers the time and the money bit. So it's about, as a contractor, it's about creating that audit trail to say, I spotted the problem early, I've notified the problem early, I've given enough information as I can, enough solutions to overcome the problem to create the audit trail. Well, I've given the decision now to the employer as to what they want to do. There is always a provision in JCT around using best endeavours to mitigate delay. Unfortunately, the law on this is a little bit vague. Again, the courts will say, well, it rather depends on the circumstances. And the million-dollar question always asked of me is, well, how much does a contractor have to put their hand in the pocket to overcome it? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes, it depends again. All I would say, though, again, it's about creating an audit trail. As a contractor, I'd be saying to the client, this is the issue, and this is what I'm trying to do to overcome it. I can do this, this, this. I cannot do this, this, this for these reasons. And the penultimate bullet point there is the really good one as well from a contractor's point of view. is ask the client what they think I should be doing as a contractor to meet that obligation. And again, it's all about creating that audit trail, so we could never be criticised as a contractor for not doing what the contract requires us to do. I'll come on later as to how you can shed some more light on what best endeavours might be, or how you determine when a consent is unreasonably refused, but this is the position under existing contracts where we don't have the benefit of that. Final bullet point, unfortunately, it's a price contract with a defined time to finish. The problem is fundamentally one of the contractors, so it's for contractors out there to drive this process. An employer could quite easily sit there and say, well, it's a price and the time for finishing. Let me know when you have finished. So a contractor needs to drive this process. On that basis, Claire, I think that's probably all I need to do on existing JCT. Claire's going to now run through a couple of other forms in terms of how to deal with the same issue, and I'll come back later on as to how we make changes to JCT for future contracts. Over to you, Claire.
So I thought I'd take a quick look at the NEC4 provisions on inflation. Obviously, without express provision, in option A, which is the price contract with activity schedule, and option B, price contract with bill of quantities, the risk of inflation is solely at the contractor's risk. In option C and D, target cost, then the contractor and employer share the risk. So if your defined costs are higher because of inflation, where you sit in relation to the target is going to shift, so your pain may be more and you'll gain less. But how that works out will depend on where your target ends up being in relation to your defined costs. And for the other options, the employer takes the risk, for example, on cost reimbursable. But the NEC4 does have provisions on inflation which are used. They only apply to options A, B, C and D, which are the ones I've just covered. A price adjustment factor is applied when that option is selected. So for options A and B, the prices for the work done to date are adjusted for inflation at each of application or stage payment. With options C and D, the target, which is the total of the prices, is adjusted for inflation. So your defined cost will be higher, but your target will adjust according to the index you've selected, and hopefully your gain will remain where it should be, depending on what level inflation is shown in the index. But there's no adjustment for inflation after the completion date. That's in clause X 1.2. So you, as a contractor, will obviously take the inflationary risk if you're in culpable delay. So if you're going to use these provisions, it's obviously important you identify an appropriate index or indices for any materials, equipment, etc. that's the inflationary index is going to apply to. And these are examples of some of the indexes. Some things to have in mind: how often is that index updated? If it's updated more frequently in some forms of contract, that means you get the benefit of the rise. Well, you could get the deflationary, but in the current circumstances, it's going to be the rise applied more often. And be clear precisely what index you are referring to. If you go onto the website for BCIS and just have a look at all that, the list, the sheer range of indices that are available, it would be very easy not to put the full title of that index, and then you could have a Barney about which one applies, because it can make a very big difference to how much money you're getting, particularly in very high value contracts. Also provide for what happens if the index in question ceases to be produced. I had that on a target cost contract. The indices was not provided in the same form anymore, and it was called something completely different, the one that effectively replaced it. So there was then a dispute as to whether that was the correct indice, or there was something else that was more appropriate, what rate was appropriate, because they both different indices show different rates. It made a very big difference in terms of how much money you were going to get at the end of the day. So you want to sort of have a default mechanism if all things go wrong, who selects what replaces the index that is no longer being produced. And you need to make sure that you fill in the contract data properly. What requires adjustment? Is it just one particular thing, or is it everything? Equipment, plant, fuel, people, have a think about that. What proportion of the value of that element is going to be subject to the inflationary index? So it may be that only some of the risk is taken off you, it wouldn't be a risk factor of 1, might be less than that. What is the base date for the indices? Because that obviously determines where your calculations start from. As I said, the actual selection of the indices is going to make a big difference. You also need it to match what you're trying to apply the inflationary index to. But there may be different choices and they may be more favourable or less favourable, so that needs some thought as well. And then the NEC4, the calculation isn't necessarily repeated when there's a new index, whilst it is in the NEC3, so some differences in how they are applied. So obviously Dave's gone through some sort of high-level principles on approaching claims generally. I'm just going to have a briefer look at the NEC4 in terms of limited sort of other assistance you might get from compensation events. Obviously, we've got the possible hook of 60.119, which is the equivalent of the force majeure provision, which we were all sort of looking at in depth last year. That's set out below. The only thing I would say is, at the moment, obviously, it depends on when you entered into this contract, what was foreseeable at the contract date. If your contract is post-COVID, you may have a sort of weaker argument as to the impact of COVID is arguably having on inflation and delays of materials at the moment. You need to prove causation. You need to prove that it is COVID or it is a force majeure event falling within this definition that has caused the problem. And the perfect storm, as Dave's described at the moment, that may be difficult because it seems to be a range of factors that are having the impact we're seeing. And then you've got to prove causation, the direct link between COVID and what's actually happening to your particular equipment or something. That may be easy, that may be difficult, but you need to prove that link. You can't just say COVID, I get out of jail free. There's also option X2, which is a change of law. Going to be difficult on Brexit. Again, causation is going to be difficult, but also the change of law has to occur after the contract date. When did Brexit or the law that has impacted on your particular piece of kit or people take effect? How does that match to your contract date? And again, proving causation is going to be difficult. So just have also a quick look at the FIDIC form. Red Book, Yellow Book and Pink Book also contain provisions for indexation. It's 13.7 as the relevant clause in the 2017 editions and 13.8 in the 1999 editions. These do not apply in the same way that the NEC clause doesn't apply unless it's expressly selected. So if you're entering into new contracts, you obviously need to give this particular thought at the moment. And the clause says that you have to fill in the schedules of cost indexation and include those in the contract for it to apply. So you need to make sure you actually annex those into the contract and fill them out. Provisional indexes are used for the interim payment certificates until updated indices are issued. So when the calculations are done on your interim payment certificates, so again, it's a good reason to get an index that's actually updated regularly, maybe more than as often as possible, basically, in this circumstances is going to be helpful. And again, if the work's not completed before the time for completion, whatever is more favourable to the employer applies. So it'll be the index or price applicable 49 days before the time for completion, or adjustment using current index. So I suppose if it's gone down, the prices have gone down in that time period, then it may be the adjustment using current index, but it's going to be likely to be the older one in the current circumstances. So again, anything else in FIDIC that may be helpful, just very high level. You've obviously got 13.6, change in law after the base date, possibly, maybe Brexit, depending on when your contract was entered into. Again, causation is going to be difficult. There may be other laws flowing out of the COVID situation that maybe will be helpful. Extension of time under 8.5D, unforeseeable shortages in the availability of personnel or goods caused by epidemic or governmental actions and not reasonably foreseeable by an experienced contractor by the base date. Depending on when your base date is, that could be very helpful for an extension of time. Because it's slightly wider in drafting, caused by epidemic, that would be COVID, governmental actions, both. You can see that maybe being an easier clause to squeeze into potentially. Anything else? You've got the exceptional events provisions. Again, I can see that being arguable for COVID, but you're going to have to prove causation, and you're going to have to see when your contract was entered into compared to when you're being hit by these impacts. It must be beyond your control, and again, you couldn't reasonably be provided against it before entering into the contract. That is going to be harder to argue if you've entered into the contract recently. As with all FIDIC claims, you've got time bars, you've got a duty to minimise delay, and for this provision you get extension time but no cost for a natural catastrophe. And there's also a right of termination if performance is suspended for 84 days in a row or multiple periods of 140 days. We're hoping we're never going to be in that position, but if things got sufficiently bad, you can see it may possibly apply. So with that cheerful overview in mind, just going to turn to some things to think about going forwards. One of those is obviously advance payment and how that could be used to enable the earlier purchase of key materials or equipment, either to mitigate the inflationary risk or to mitigate the delay risk if there are shortages, to ensure you can get there earlier with an advance payment for a turbine or a condenser or something really key, to get there in early. But there are things to think about. How is that money protected? Obviously, you want financial checks carried out on the supplier, particularly in the current environment. If you hand over that money, are they going to be able to actually produce the goods? Are they solvent? Where are the goods going to be stored, or the equipment going to be stored once it's produced? And linked to that, who's going to hold the title in those goods? Where does the title flow down? And it's not just about checking your contract, it's about checking the contracts further down the line and trying to make those marry up so everybody ideally knows who has the title, and ideally it's you if you've paid the money over in those goods. Is some form of advance payment bond required? Obviously there's a cost associated with that, but if it's a very high value thing you're paying over for, then you would want some protection. And also thinking about the mechanisms, how's that payment going to be earned back? Make sure you don't, for example, have to get the money paid back before the goods arrive on site, in terms of when you're going to sort of show that in your applications for payment, you paid for the goods or credit it back. So things to think about there. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Dave.
Thank you, Claire. Right, so as I mentioned, the first bit of my talk was focusing on contracts that already are in place and what we can hang our hat on in terms of getting some time and some more money. What I'm now going to look at is, if we are about to sign a new contract, what do we need to deal with? Obviously, I was having the same webinars and discussions this time last year, a bit earlier, in terms of what we deal with COVID. Do we put something in there? Do we put something in terms of triggering time and money? Yes, we do. We're going to have the same things in contracts going forwards now. Now, I completely understand it's all about the bargaining position a contractor will have to force these things through and be able to negotiate themselves. All I would say is, what we're seeing now, I don't think employers can no longer sort of credibly sit there and say, well, the risk can be passed down the supply chain. It's far more complicated than that. We know the risk cannot be passed down the supply chain, so it needs a bit of a more sophisticated approach to it. Again, getting back to the basics of actual money in terms of the price of it and the delay in actually getting the materials. There is no substitution around using the JCT fluctuations. Again, I've mentioned the fact that they are rarely used on existing projects. They will have to be used on projects going forwards, I think, unless they're of a particularly short duration, or you can take some of the measures that Claire has suggested in terms of buying and securing materials early on. I know some contractors now are getting early orders to allow to secure manufacturing slots to secure materials early, so that's one way around it and secure it at a price. What I'm also seeing again is that if fluctuations are being used, they are limited to certain bits of the project, so it won't be a blanket across the board. There will be certain bits of the project picked out and identified as being high risk, whether that's steel, whether it's cement, whether it's timber, whatever it might be. Those particular bits are identified and dealt with separately. They are often also dealt with separately within the contract documents bit rather than the front bit of the JCT. So as making sure they apply and they're clear, be very clear how you are documenting that deal on inflation for certain patches of work. Claire has always mentioned some of the problems if you tie it to an indices. Which indices is it? does the indices exist? Just think carefully, precisely what are you saying and how are you documenting the fluctuation risk? It all might be super well to say this one's subject to inflation or the price might go up, but what do we really mean by that? Just run through a typical scenario to make sure that whatever's, written in the back of that contract, it works if you need to dust it off, okay? What we are seeing on a lot of projects, particularly the shorter duration projects, is because this is nobody's particular fault, it is a neutral event, there is a divvying up of the risk, and that typically, rather like COVID and Brexit was, the divvying up of the risk is it's a time but not a money event, okay? So you can mitigate to a certain extent some of the money risk by securing stuff up front and securing the packages. The timing risk is still potentially there. So how would I go about tweaking my relevant events, or whatever the time event be in my contract, to deal with some of the issues that we are currently facing? My first little indented bullet. I see lots of drafting out there that says you, contractor, have allowed for everything that is reasonably foreseeable. Okay, lots of things are reasonably foreseeable, but that does not mean they are allowed for. Last summer, we were sitting here thinking, is it reasonably foreseeable that there might be a third, fourth, fifth lockdown? Well, yes. Ask the contractor if the program allows for it, the answer will be no. Okay, so be very wary of anything that just talks about events being reasonably foreseeable. You need to be a bit more precise about what we mean, and also the fact that lots of things are foreseeable but are not allowed for. Okay, our second little bullet. What I am seeing sometimes is, again, people trying to copy and paste old Brexit provisions and COVID provisions and saying, well, there you go, that will cover you. Okay, Claire and I have already touched on the point. I query to what extent we are so far down the road now that this is still linked to Brexit or COVID. I think you need far more precision around that to whether that is actually the case. Okay, we are a good 18 months on now from COVID. Query whether some of these issues we're facing are linked directly or indirectly to COVID. So you need more precision around the drafting. The other thing I would do as a contractor is try and shed some more light on what we need on phrases like using best endeavours to mitigate a delay. As I mentioned, the court will sit there and say, well, it all really depends, doesn't it, on the circumstances. That is of little use, to be honest, for either party in terms of trying to construe that contract. So what I would always do for a contractor or a client is sit down there and work out where we consider the particular risk to be on a project, and say, right, if this occurs, what will we do to overcome it? Or what could we do to overcome it? And then the list of things, I would say, right, the cost associated with that sits where? Okay, so it's a question of what are we going to do? And do we think that's a no cost event? I'll do it. Or do we think that should be a shared cost event, or whatever it might be? But it requires a bit more sophistication around what we mean by using best endeavours. Okay, what you will find as well from an employer's side of view, you will need to be able to demonstrate, probably as a contractor, that this is something affecting the industry as a whole, or at least a big chunk of the industry, because otherwise it would be very easy, wouldn't it, for a contractor to say, my particular supply chain has let me down. That's because we maybe use someone very cheap who promised the earth. So that in terms of balancing out how these clauses work, you're going to need to be able to demonstrate as a contractor, I think, well, this is not something affecting me. It is something affecting the whole industry. Just think how you would do that in terms of if you had to prove it. Okay, I've already touched on the fact that sometimes this is now wider than materials. We've got issues of labour and transport. We could have a factory full of materials, we just can't get it to the site. We've got issues with labour now in terms of the cost of actual labour and the availability of it. So we need to think wider than just materials. It's all sorts of factors that are affecting the industry as a whole. Okay, so just think a little bit wider how we draft those time events. What we will also need to allow for is, let me just get that slide to move on. 2 seconds, there it is. You need to try and benchmark where you are and what has been allowed for. So again, this time last year, I was saying to contractors, right, we know that the current CLC guidelines that we're working to, they add 25% of our program. That is what we are working to, okay? You then measure if the provisions become more onerous, we've got something to benchmark against and we know what we have allowed for. An interesting argument with the current issues is to be able to share our program or our procurement schedule with the employer and say, right, this is what I've assumed at the current market. So I might say piling is a price of X on a lead time of 15, 20 weeks, whatever it might be. Do you, employer, consider that reasonable as at today's date for me to allow for that? If the answer is yes, we have a deal. If the answer is no, then clearly a contractor's then got to look again at that program. But what it does allow you to do, of course, is benchmark that my program at the moment, my lead times are reasonable, and that allows me to then measure, or potentially better measure, what's been allowed for and therefore the delay around it. Okay. Substitution materials. Again, I've already mentioned how standard JCT works, so it's a little bit vague about what unreasonably withholding consent might be. Put a bit more meat on the bone and describe what that might be. So if you look, for example, at a typical agreement for lease, it might say the landlord will allow the tenant to make any changes they want to the building, provided they don't do the following. Okay, they don't affect the overall aesthetics of the building. They don't affect the landlord's base build systems. They are certain provisions you have to clear through. It would be quite useful to be able, as a contractor, to say, I can make these following changes provided they fit within this box. If it's not an aesthetic-led thing, okay, if it performs exactly the same, if it meets all the relevant building regs, as a contractor, am I allowed to make that change without having the discussion around whether the consent is required and whether that consent can be unreasonably withheld? Okay, you can have the debate now. It's easy to look at something because I know that clients are going to be interested, presumably, in those things that are potentially more of an aesthetic thing. Okay, but you can discuss those and clarify those points now. Okay, I talked about the wording that talks about JCT not being procurable. It needs to be wider than that. Remember, if I'm going to if I'm not going to have a relevant that gives me time, I need to clarify what not procurable means. They are procurable, but they're more difficult to get, or I get them on a piecemeal basis. Okay. Think carefully how ERs, CPs, and specs are written. CPs could be written fairly loosely, and you don't commit to a particular product or manufacturer much later on, which gives a contractor much more flexibility. Okay. Think about how architects write specs, the words or similar, approved, or something very similar. Whether something similar, of course, a question of fact, whether something is approved or not, does that bring in the same duty on the architect CA as the client has under the clause 2 I mentioned, in terms of unreasonably withholding something, the approval to something? Think about how that works in context of what the front bit of the JCT applies. I have had some projects where at the outset we can identify potential problem areas. So that might be a particular specialist light fitting or a reception desk in a project, whatever it might be. When you sit down and talk to the contractor, where is the potential risk in the project, and you highlight several things. When you then come up and say, well, what is the plan to get around it? You might find that actually there could be some sort of temporary solution put in place to allow the project to get PC with this work being done afterwards. Again, it's very project specific, but it's quite a practical solution to the problem, because if the building still works, that element of work that is likely to be delayed or could be delayed can be done afterwards. Provisional sums also allow a contractor a bit of flexibility. Be very careful about how the contract deals with provisional sums. Are they defined, undefined? Check exactly how the mechanism works in terms of allowance for program, allowance for uplifts. So provisional sums can be used. You will always get, of course, clients trying to restrict the amount of provisional sums, but ultimately, if there is a risk to a certain package of work in that project, then a provisional sum may well be the only way around it. What I also see sometimes is below the line contingency. Get to the contract sum, 2 million, and then there is a contingency below the line. It always remains a mystery to me as to exactly what the contingency is for and when it kicks in. I think there's a sort of assumed understanding as to how it works, but I think I would put some wording around what precisely that contingency is due to cover, because there's no corresponding bit in the front bit of the contract that says how that is dealt with. So that's just a few ideas about how you might want to deal with the risks going forward. Again, it's focused to JCT, but the same principles apply, I think, to whatever form of contract you're looking at. Remember, from a subcontractor supplier's point of view, remember my opening mantra, it's all about the contract. That is exactly the same at subcontractor to main contractor level as it is main contractor to employer. It's exactly the same principles. Okay, so just bear that in mind for suppliers and subcontractors. It's the same issues you need to think about. Okay, on that basis, Claire, hopefully I've covered all the sort of tips that some people might like, and I'll hand back over to you for a bit more of a reminder on how you might progress the claim if there's one there to hang your hat on, Claire.
Yeah, just to emphasise as usual rules on claims apply. They're always going to be easier to advance if you've got the records. You're still going to need to show causation. How are you going to demonstrate the impact of the delays if they've been caused by late delivery of goods? Perhaps you need key delivery dates for key elements of work shown in the programme more clearly than you would do normally, with the mechanism, what happens if that's late, etc., clearly linked in the programme. Hopefully you've got some hooks in the older crop tracks where possible, but it's going to be a lot easier if your contract expressly provides for the risks in question for new contracts going forwards. You still have the obligations of notices and time bars that you need to adhere to, particularly in NEC and FIDIC. Make use of the early warning notices and risk management meetings, etc. Even if your contract is unfavourably drafted and there's a fixed price and there's little wriggle room, at least by sort of engaging in the other parties involved in that process, you can try and minimise any damage as much as possible. And also think about how you can demonstrate that these issues were actually unforeseeable. Too often we see blanket, it's COVID mate, and then there's no link between, well, we couldn't have anticipated this, or how this happened, etc. It's putting the whole picture rather than just saying a one-liner, because that's not going to get you off the hook. So overview, for new contracts, you need to think very carefully about the appropriate level of risk allocation. Insolvency, which is an increasing risk in this environment, is not in anyone's interests. Use the provisions available in the standard forms for inflationary risks, even if that hasn't been done historically, for example, in the JCT scenario. Consider bespoke provisions, as Dave has just outlined. Keep on top of any of the latest guidance from the government. The CLC, for example, publishes regular updates. Obviously, it helps if you can diversify your supply chain as much as possible and keep on top of its financial status, so carry out regular credit checks. But it is hard to argue that the current issues are unforeseeable if you're entering into contracts now, so your drafting needs to make it clear what happens if these events continue and to give you a right to an EOT or a variation, etc., if they do. For older contracts, there may possibly be hooks based on COVID-19, possibly Brexit, but they're going to be harder, and the longer the time goes on, I think the harder it is to make those claims, because the link between cause and effects becomes more obscure. And obviously records are essential, as we all know. So with that in mind, any questions?
Dave and Claire, thank you very much. That's such a comprehensive and, Claire, as you say, cheerful overview of the area. We've had a lot of questions come in, so thank you very much to the audience. Given the time, we won't be able to get through all of them, but no doubt Claire and Dave can give back to you personally and directly afterwards. But let's go to Dave, Claire. We've been talking about a lot about contractors and subcontractors and so forth. A good question on the professional team. How do these issues affect the professional team? Is there anything we should be thinking about?
Do you want me to do it on, Stacey? I can jump in.
Super, thank you.
We've got to be a QS in terms of doing a cost plan for a project now. There's so many caveats in the cost plan for the QS. That's the first point of view. So from a QS's point of view, it's a tricky one to price the jobs, I imagine, or accurately, which leaves them obviously up in the air as to whether they are runners or not. In terms of contract administrators, I talked a lot about the changes that can be made to design to overcome problems, or changes to materials to overcome problems. Think very carefully as your role of CA, remember. First of all, you are the agent to a certain extent of the client, so your scope to agree those changes may well be limited by what your appointment says with your client. So I think from that point of view, I'd be very, very careful to make sure that I am having the client buy into the decisions I'm making to change materials or to change the design, etc., etc. So the first point is bear in mind your appointment and the clarity and confirmation you get from the employer around what you are doing to overcome the problem. I think the second problem from a CA's point of view, some of these events are tricky, aren't they? We've got a panel of lawyers here going, well, is it force majeure, is it not force majeure, waiting on a court's decision. It's tricky for a CA to sit there, isn't it, and say, well, I've had a claim for time from a contractor relying on the grounds of force majeure. Is it force majeure or not? So I think, again, as a CA, you're expected to have a reasonable grasp of the law, but at the end of the day, you're not lawyers, remember. So think very carefully about how you grant time based on when you have a wide provision like force majeure. It's not as clear cut as a change or a client changes. It's down at the bottom of the list because it's vague and sort of needs a bit more thought. So as a CA point of view, be very careful how you grant time, if you do grant time, based on a force majeure event. So I think finally, yeah, and the other point, the relevant instructions, when you are agreeing to changes, again, it is a concession to the contractor, isn't it? So be careful how that is documented. If a change is made to overcome a problem that is fundamentally the contractor's, it's not a change or a variation as such, it's a concession, and there is nil cost and nil time associated with it usually. So just be careful how that is written, okay? But otherwise, there's a few tips for the professional team.
Super. Thank you, Dave. We've had a lot of questions come in that are a bit more general, so it might be an opportunity to recap some of the points that you said previously. But one question, possibly Claire, how do you get around a contract with firm and fixed material prices where through no fault of your own, for example, COVID, you essentially face losses occasioned by rising market prices but have no contractual right of recourse?
Well, it's a tricky one is the answer. I mean, I've outlined some of the provisions that might give you some respite. Try and go under force majeure potentially. In the NEC form, that's arguably more generous because you could potentially get your costs as well as time, depending on proving that link. But it's difficult. If it's a fixed price contract, you have ultimately taken that risk, subject to what is expressly provided for in that contract. So it's just trying to review the contract as a whole, as Dave said. Perhaps there's something in the back that may assist, and go through the events, but it's not an easy one, unfortunately.
It's almost back to it's the same point, Stacey, I started with, is that the only thing that matters is what the contract says. There's no magic legal dust we can sprinkle to undo a bad commercial deal or something where commercial forces have changed since we signed up. We've had, the industry has had the benefit of, as I mentioned before, fluctuations haven't been used for 20 years because we know that it's been fairly stable for 20 years. It all comes out of the blue, but it fundamentally is a commercial risk. And if it's not covered in the contract, it's very, very tricky. Very tricky on the pricing side of it.
That magic legal dust, I think, comes up time again, doesn't it? And where is it? Let's fit another question in. Dave, possibly one for you. How do you quantify an unreasonable length of time when assessing impediment prevention or default by the employer? Okay.
Again, a lawyer's answer depends on the circumstance, but let me give you an example. Let's go back to my substitution of materials point. So let's say as a fit out contractor, I can't get fan coil A, but I can get fan coil B, okay? So I go to the client, which is the tenant in the building, and I say, right, this is the problem. This is my suggested solution. This is why it works, etc., etc. If the tenant then has to get the landlord sign off, I could see why it's plausible to say it's going to take longer for that process to go through. Okay, if they've got to go and either get bank consent or consent from somebody else or the landlord, I can see how you would look at giving a client a longer period of time to make that decision than would otherwise be the case, because there's other factors at play. Could be a planning issue, for example. A change could require planning. So that might be one of the factors would be, well, what has the client got to do to allow them to make a decision? The other factor would be, which is back to my point about this is a contractor, effectively a contractor concession we're asking for. You've got to give the client all the ammunition they need. So as a contractor, I'd be going to the client and saying, here's the proof that it's the same or better quality than the one you asked for. This is the detail on the lead time. I've already spoken to the landlord before you even got the consent. I'm trying to address all the potential issues that I know the client will have to deal with. What that will allow then is a shorter period of time, because I've given the client everything they need. If I've come to them at the last minute and said, I'd like to swap this for this, I could see why a client might say I need a lot longer period of time. Whereas if I give them everything they need to make the decision, it shortens that period of time in terms of showing whether they've been reasonable in agreeing or not. So again, it's back to my point, the contractor drives the process. The contractor has to drive the process.
Having a paper trail that sells your story of how you sort of try to.
Correct. Because we know the questions that the client will ask and the architect will ask is proof that it's the same product, proof that the actual maintenance periods or the estimated lifespan of the product is the same. Have that information ready so that those questions aren't asked on a piecemeal basis, which lengthens the period of time to get the decision. Then the client could say, well, we never gave me the information, therefore the period of time is not 8 weeks, but is 15 weeks. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of the time. Dave, Claire, thank you very much. And audience, thank you very much for writing your questions. I will pass those to Dave and Claire, and hopefully we can do our best to get back to you direct. But everyone, thank you very much for joining today. If I can, just one last thing before we wrap up, and that's our webinar in 2 weeks' time on the 14th of October, same time, same place, Thursday at 12 o'clock. And we have our James Mullen and barrister Daniel Churcher, who are going to give us an adjudication update, number 5 in our series here. And we very much look forward to having that, and we hope you can join us then. So thank you again for joining. Dave, Claire, thank you very, very much. And I hope everyone stays safe where they are, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.